All right, I just got back from the Caroline Ellison sentencing in New York from inside the courtroom and just want to recap everything we heard because it did not go according to what we heard from Bernie Madoff's former lead prosecutor, Mark Litt, who said there was zero chance that Caroline Ellison would be seeing any jail time.
I don't view it as a close call. If
Yeah,
she got a
which
day in jail, if she got a day in jail, I would fall off my seat.
instead, what we got was Caroline Ellison receiving a 2-year sentence, 24 months in prison at a low security facility, and 3 years probation. So just want to recap everything that happened inside the courtroom for those who weren't there, which is probably most everyone watching this. Caroline Ellison's attorney, Anjan Sani, basically said that his client was a privilege to know. In fact, he opened with, "It's been a privilege to know Caroline Ellison," as he addressed the court, discussing why she was actually not the reason why FTX collapsed, and in fact was probably one of those people who did everything that they could to save it from collapsing. Anjan Sani basically said Caroline wasn't involved in the fraud from the beginning, instead kind of highlighting how she was hired after all the FTX founders, co-founders, including Sam Bankman-Fried, had gotten together and set everything up. As the CEO of Alameda Research, she was a bit detached from everything else, which of course we've already seen is not entirely true considering the fact that she's already pled guilty to all of the charges here. Facing 110 years, she was basically looking at the same amount of prison time on the high end in terms of sentencing guidelines. Anjan Sani's job here was essentially to really prove the point and show that, look, she cooperated with the government, she did everything she could when she realized this was not going to end well, and basically helped the government convict Sam Bankman-Fried at trial. Anjan Sani stressed the point that Caroline Ellison said that, in hindsight, she sees that she shouldn't have stayed at Alameda Research, and basically that she's done everything to help since then, as she realized that this wasn't going to be good. He also stressed that if Caroline Ellison was to receive prison time, it would show that the government doesn't actually value cooperation because Caroline Ellison was such a key witness in this case. Keep in mind that she also had agreed to settlements to forfeit all of the money that she had made from FTX and Alameda to give those back to FTX victims and the government. In this, she also had signed over to never profit essentially from any of telling her story in the FTX collapse, and that if she was paid for that, whether it be a book or a Netflix series, that she would never profit in the future, and that she had recovered her moral compass, which I suppose would mean that she at some point lost it during the point of all of this, and also had become a very upstanding citizen since these crimes were admitted to, noting that she's been serving in a soup kitchen and sending books to prisoners, though there was not any more detail on which prisoners exactly she had been sending those books to. After that, Judge Kaplan turned and said, "Caroline Ellison, would you like to address the court?" And that is when Caroline Ellison stepped to the podium. Caroline first addressed the court by saying that she said she wants to say that she's sorry, and that not a day goes by where I don't think about the people I've hurt. I am so, so sorry. We abused the trust that FTX was able to establish. Now, of course, as we heard from SBF when he was sentenced, there wasn't a lot of remorse. He said the same thing, that he was sorry, but he didn't really regret anything in the way that things went, or at least in terms of what he tried to do in the collapse. Not exactly the case from Caroline Ellison. She basically had admitted already, keep in mind she's already pled guilty to these crimes, but she was sitting there as she sniffled, basically saying that, look, a lot of people have chosen to end their friendships with me, and that she, quote, doesn't blame them one bit. She also thanked her new partner, who remains unnamed, saying that I couldn't have done this without you, in terms of actually getting to the point where she was talking to the court and apologizing for everything she did. Relatively short, not as long as what we heard from SBF, not nearly as rambling, basically just, like 5 minutes-ish, essentially 5 minutes, of Caroline Ellison apologizing to everyone there. Next, we heard from the prosecutor who had basically led the government's case against Sam Bankman-Fried, and a very different than last time, since we heard from Danielle Sassoon, the lead prosecutor in this case. She basically opened by contrasting Caroline Ellison's role in all this with that of SBF, when she basically talked about how much prison time SBF should receive. It was a very different tone that we heard from prosecutor Sassoon. Instead, She contrasted SBF not showing any remorse when he addressed the court with what everyone had just heard from Caroline Ellison, saying that leniency is warranted here. And again, contrasted what she called SBF, a con artist, with a person who exhibits remorse in Caroline Ellison. And in the government's view, a lenient sentence is also what is just. At least that's what she told Judge Kaplan. Keep in mind, the sentencing guidelines here, the probation department, alcohol is not involved in the courtroom, but the probation department had basically said that there shouldn't be any jail time here. And the government wrote a lengthy memo talking about why Caroline Ellison had been so helpful in getting to a conviction against SBF. And that's basically what we heard from Danielle Sassoon again. She said, "I cannot overstate the importance or the helpfulness in convicting SBF that came from Caroline Ellison, and that the government would have had a tough time save for Caroline Ellison's testimony and the way that she helped out." In fact, went as far as saying that if she had sided with SBF's attempt to craft a narrative as this just simply being a liquidity crunch, then there's a good chance that SBF might not have been convicted. So again, stressing the importance of Caroline Ellison truly being cooperative in this case. And also noting that while Bankman-Fried was basically out to dupe everyone, in her words, Danielle Sassoon also said that Caroline Ellison is not cunning. So all of that took about 30 minutes, and that is when Judge Kaplan took over after basically giving both sides the opportunity to add anything else. 30 minutes, not a long time, but that's when Judge Kaplan basically began his setup for what the final sentencing was going to be. Keep in mind, Judge Kaplan really did, I think, nail what the court delivered in the sentencing for SBF at 25 years, basically saying that, well, he said he was remorseful, he probably would do it again. And then Judge Kaplan basically went through the same kind of logic for Caroline Ellison, noting two things. In terms of the sentencing guidelines basically being binding in past years, no longer the case after the way that the Supreme Court ruled, essentially pretty strong leeway in terms of what he wants to do with sentencing, though he's supposed to listen to the government's letter, which was very extensive in saying that Caroline Ellison probably shouldn't get jail time. However, Judge Kaplan also noted that he's willing to do whatever he needs to do in terms of deterring future criminals from carrying out the same types of crime. And that's basically the backbone of how Judge Kaplan landed on 2 years for Caroline Ellison. He mentioned that there are two things to deter. One, the idea that Caroline Ellison could repeat some of these crimes if she didn't go to jail, which he said was basically a 0% chance, so he admitted that. But two, the deterrence of other criminals or other people potentially looking to maybe also exploit the potential if they cooperate with the government, that maybe they wouldn't go to jail. And that is essentially the thrust of how Judge Kaplan landed on 2 years plus 3 years probation. He spent a good amount of time crediting Caroline Ellison for cooperating with the government, and also echoed a lot of the things that Danielle Sassoon told to the court as well, including saying that in his 30 years of being a judge, he had never seen a cooperator like Caroline Ellison. He said that there probably wasn't a single detail that he could remember in terms of her admissions to the court, to the government, to prosecutors, to investigators even, all the way back in December of 2022, to as he stood there in the courtroom reading her sentencing, that basically she was above and beyond what she needed to admit to, but that it also made her no less culpable to the crimes that she had already pled guilty to. He said, in a lot of ways, you're a very strong person, but you're not inviolable. And this is kind of a weird point. He said, for whatever reason, Sam Bankman-Fried was your kryptonite, and essentially said that she was vulnerable and that she was exploited. He also gave her credit that her remorse that she had just voiced was the real thing, and once again took a chance to dunk on Sam Bankman-Fried, saying that what he voiced at his sentencing was not the real thing, and that if he could do it again, he probably would roll the dice again. And that's where he landed on his contrasting with Caroline Ellison's sentencing, contrasting that of hers with Sam Bankman-Fried's, essentially saying that because there is a level of deterrence here for other people potentially replicating the largest fraud in American history, or at least the largest crypto fraud in American history, that it's an important piece of his sentencing. And that is when he delivered what I think was the real quote to get from all this. Essentially giving her so much credit that she was cooperating with the government from the very get-go would still be giving her a literal get-out-of-jail-free card if he were to fully say, Caroline Ellison, you get 0 days in jail. And that's the point where it became very obvious that he was going to land on jail time. And that was pretty interesting. I mean, again, this was not expected to be the case and the outcome for Caroline Ellison, given what we heard from other legal attorneys who are probably the right people to talk to in terms of Bernie Madoff's former lead prosecutor at Mark Litt. But also just given the fact that the government's memo, the sentencing memo, was more than 10 pages documenting why they themselves, the prosecutors in this case, thought that Caroline Ellison shouldn't get any jail time. In the end, Judge Kaplan disagreed and said that it is important to basically reinforce the deterrence, and you can't really have the number 2 or number 3, depending on which way you want to look at it. Nonetheless, a very key, big executive in this scheme walk with no jail time. And really, if you think about it, as I was sitting there, having listened to Mark Litt tell us yesterday that she probably wouldn't go to jail.
If she got a day in jail, I would fall off my seat.
That just didn't make sense with kind of what we've seen in other cases. Even, OpenSea's former executive who had been convicted of insider trading, though the judge in that case basically said, I don't think this case would have been brought to me. It's only like 50 grand in terms of basically ill-gotten gains, which is lower than what normal cases, the threshold that a normal case would have to be brought in front of a judge or in front of a court. The judge in that case was basically like, the only reason you are bringing this case, government, is because it's NFTs. And because you've brought this case, I kind of have to deliver jail time for deterrence as well. But also mention that it was a little twisted in terms of why this case was really brought. And if he got, for $50,000, I think it was like 6 months in jail. If he got 6 months in jail or 3 months, I can't remember entirely which one it was. I think it's 6. But if it was half a year, you can't really sit there and justify that sentencing with the idea of Caroline Ellison getting 0 years in prison, even if she did cooperate. That would seem tricky to square for someone who bought and sold NFTs that were going to be listed on OpenSea. So when you square those two things and think about the billions of dollars that customers of FTX were built out of, even whether or not whatever happens at the bankruptcy outcome that we've been covering for Coinage, even aside from that, it really wouldn't add up if Caroline Ellison got 0 years in prison. So in hindsight, kind of seems obvious at this point. But nonetheless, that's essentially what happened in the courtroom where it all just went down. Caroline Ellison getting 2 years and 3 years probation. And in the end, we'll now have to see what happens with the other 2 FTX execs that still also await sentencing in terms of Gary Wang and Nishad Singh. Those 2 had also pled guilty to crimes, but they did not plead guilty as quickly as Caroline Ellison. So if their attorneys are watching this all play out, things are not looking good for them as we await their sentencings to come from Judge Kaplan as well. So 2 years and 3 versus the 25 years Sam got. You'd suspect some of those maybe would be in the middle in terms of their sentencings, but the guidelines and everything else that we've heard from the experts we've talked to essentially out the door now after the ruling today. Maybe now's a good reminder to say, check out our full series digging into the defense that Sam Bankman-Fried had given us back before his trial began, back before he was actually thrown in jail for what Judge Kaplan at the time called witness tampering against Caroline Ellison. You can click the box wherever it may be to go check out that full series, also including former Bernie Madoff prosecutor Mark Litt. Go check that out. Smash the like button. Comment on the video. Let us know if you think that this was justice served. And do not forget to subscribe to Coinage for more.